He thought the password was the only thing standing between him and everything my father built. He had no idea the password was never the point. My father died on a Tuesday in March, quietly, the way he had lived without asking anyone for anything. He was 58 years old, a retired civil engineer who had spent 30 years drawing bridges and drainage systems for a county that barely remembered his name once he handed in his badge. He was not a wealthy man in the way people use that word at cocktail parties, but he was careful, methodical, the kind of man who kept a fireproof box under his bed and paid off his mortgage 11 years early and never once mentioned it to anyone. He left behind a house, a truck, 2 savings accounts, a life insurance policy, and my mother. He also left behind a folder, a plain manila folder, the kind you can buy at any drugstore, that he handed to me 6 months before he died, when we both still pretended we had more time than we did. "Don't open this until you need to," he said. I asked him when I would know. He looked at me the way he always did when he thought I was asking a question I already knew the answer to. "You'll know," he said. I was 31 at the time. I worked as a paralegal at a mid-sized firm in Charlotte, North Carolina. I had spent the better part of a decade reading contracts, flagging discrepancies, watching people sign documents they did not fully understand. I knew what a trust was. I knew what a power of attorney could do in the wrong hands. I knew, in the way that people who work adjacent to lawyers know things, that grief makes people vulnerable in ways that money always finds. I tucked the folder into the back of my filing cabinet, behind my tax returns, and I did not open it. My mother called me the morning he passed. Her voice was the steadiest I had ever heard it, which frightened me more than crying would have. I drove the 4 hours to their house in Greensboro and stayed for 2 weeks. We sorted through his clothes, his tools, his collection of fishing lures that he had never once used because he preferred the idea of fishing to the actual practice of it. We sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and let the silence fill the space where he used to be. I did not tell her about the folder, not because I was hiding it from her. I want to be clear about that. I did not tell her because I did not yet understand what it contained, and because I had made a promise to my father, and because some part of me believed that not opening it meant we still had time. I went back to Charlotte. I went back to work. I called my mother every Sunday, and sometimes on Wednesdays. She sounded smaller on the phone than she did in person, like grief had taken up physical space inside her and left less room for everything else. For about 14 months, that was our life. Then she mentioned a name. Daniel. She said it the way you say the name of someone you're trying to make sound unimportant. A friend from the grief support group. Someone from church. Actually, he just started coming. He's very kind. He helped me with the gutters. Each sentence was its own small introduction, as if she was walking me slowly toward a room she wasn't sure I wanted to enter. I was not opposed to my mother having company. I want to be clear about that too. She was 60 years old, and she had loved my father completely, and she deserved warmth and friendship, and someone to sit with her in the evenings so the house didn't feel so large. I was not the kind of daughter who believed her mother's grief was a debt she owed forever. But I was also a paralegal. I read documents for a living. I noticed things. The first time I met Daniel in person was at Thanksgiving, about 4 months after his name had entered our conversations. He was 54, broad-shouldered, with silver at his temples, and the kind of easy smile that people either grow naturally or practice in mirrors. He had been a regional sales manager for a medical supply company, he told me, though he was between things right now. He complimented my mother's cooking 3 times. He asked me thoughtful questions about my work. He offered to help clear the table without being asked. He was, on the surface, almost exactly what you would design if you were designing a person to appear trustworthy. But there was a moment, just one, that I filed away without meaning to. We were washing dishes after dinner, and my mother stepped out of the kitchen to answer her phone, and Daniel turned to me with the same easy smile and said, "Your mom tells me your dad was very well prepared. Smart man." It was a compliment. It was completely innocuous. It was the kind of thing you say. Except my mother had not told me she discussed my father's finances with him, and they had been together, at that point, for 4 months. I smiled and said, yes, my father was very organized, and I drove back to Charlotte the next morning, and I opened the folder. Inside was a letter, handwritten, 4 pages, in my father's careful, architectural print. There were also 3 documents, a copy of his will, A summary sheet from the attorney who had handled his estate, a woman named Patricia Elgin, whose card was paper-clipped to the top and a single page titled, "Things I Want You to Know." I sat at my kitchen table and I read all of it twice. My father had not been wealthy, but he had been precise. The house was held in a revocable living trust that had converted to an irrevocable trust at his death, with my mother as the lifetime beneficiary and me as the successor trustee. She could live there as long as she lived. She could not sell it without my authorization. She could not be pressured, coerced, or manipulated into transferring the asset, because it was not fully hers to transfer. His life insurance had gone directly to her, that was hers, clean and clear. The savings accounts had passed to her as well. But the house, the primary asset, the thing that held her stability, was protected. The letter explained why. My father had not written it out of distrust for my mother. He had written it because he understood something that I had come to understand in my years of filing paperwork for other people's disasters. That widows are targeted. That grief makes people trusting in ways they wouldn't otherwise be. That the most dangerous people are not the ones who seem dangerous. He had set this up 3 years before he died, before he was sick. He had been thinking about it that long. At the end of the letter, he wrote, "I hope you never need any of this, but if you do, Patricia will walk you through the rest. You know what to watch for. Trust what you see." I called Patricia Elgin that afternoon. She confirmed everything. She also told me that she had reached out to my mother shortly after my father's death to explain the trust structure, and that my mother had thanked her and said she understood, but had not asked many questions. I did not call my mother that night. I sat with what I knew, and I thought about the way Daniel had said, "very well prepared," in my mother's kitchen. I thought about it for a long time. Over the next several months, I started paying closer attention. I visited more. I listened carefully during our phone calls. I watched the way Daniel's presence in my mother's life expanded, how he went from helping with the gutters to being there when I called on Sunday evenings, to having a key to the back door for emergencies, to gently suggesting that my mother didn't really need to talk to her old friends from the hospital where she used to volunteer, because they only reminded her of hard times. I wrote things down. Not dramatically. Not in some official journal. I kept a notes file on my laptop. Dates. Direct quotes when I could remember them. Patterns. By the time my mother told me they were getting married, I had 11 months of notes. I was not surprised. I was not even angry. Exactly. I was something colder and more focused than angry. I called Patricia Elgin again. We had a long conversation. She walked me through exactly what my role as successor trustee meant and what it did not mean. She told me what questions to ask and what documents to keep current. She also, very gently, said that there was nothing legally I could do to prevent the marriage, and that the trust protected the house regardless. "The structure your father set up is sound," she said, "as long as you understand what you have authority over and what you don't." I understood. My mother married Daniel on a Saturday in September. It was a small ceremony, at the house, in the backyard where my father had planted a peach tree the summer I turned 7. I stood in the second row and I smiled when I was supposed to smile, and I hugged my mother and I told her I hoped she was happy. I meant it. I genuinely meant it. I wanted her to be happy. I also went home that evening and made sure every document Patricia had ever sent me was scanned, backed up in 2 locations, and that I had a current copy of the trust agreement in my own files. The shift happened gradually, and then all at once, the way these things always do. Within 3 months of the wedding, Daniel began asking questions about the house. Not aggressively, never aggressively. Not at first. Just curious how these things work. I was talking to a buddy who does real estate, and he mentioned something about trusts. "Don't you think it would make more sense for your mother to have full control of her own home?" I know because my mother told me. She didn't tell me because she was alarmed. She told me because she thought she was relaying normal conversation. I was alarmed enough for both of us. He escalated slowly. First, it was suggestions that my mother should talk to a different attorney, one he knew, someone who could simplify things. Then it was a comment about how my father probably didn't understand how these structures actually affect a surviving spouse. Then, about 8 months after the wedding, my mother called me on a Wednesday, not our usual Sunday, and she sounded the way she had sounded the morning my father died. "Daniel thinks I should sign something," she said. "Some kind of amendment. He says it's standard." She had the document in her hand. She had not signed it yet. I asked her to photograph every page and text them to me before she did anything else. It was not standard. It was a modification request that, if signed by my mother and then reviewed by a court as the beneficiary making a requested change, could have introduced ambiguity into the trust's asset distribution. It was not guaranteed to work. It was unlikely to hold up. But it was the kind of document that someone had paid someone to draft, which meant someone had spent money trying to find a crack. I forwarded it to Patricia that night with a note that said, "He tried." She called me the next morning. We had a plan within the week. I did not tell my mother everything. I want to be honest about that. I told her enough. I told her the document was not something she should sign, that it was not in her interest, that she should tell Daniel her attorney had reviewed it and advised against it. I told her clearly that the house was protected and that nothing required her signature. What I did not tell her, yet, was the scope of what I suspected, because I knew that if I told her everything in that moment, she would have one of two reactions. She would disbelieve me, because she was still inside the part of the story where she loved him, or she would believe me and fall apart, and I needed her steady for what came next. I needed her to deliver a message. She told Daniel that her daughter had questions and that nothing would be signed without a conversation. He called me directly 2 days later. This was the first time we had spoken one-on-one since Thanksgiving, almost 2 years earlier. He was smooth. I will give him that. He framed everything as concern for my mother. He used the word simplify 4 times in the first 5 minutes. He said he was just trying to make sure she's protected. He suggested, gently, that my involvement was adding stress to an already emotional situation. I let him talk. I am a paralegal. I know how to let people talk. When he finished, I told him that I appreciated his concern and that the trust structure was already reviewed by legal counsel and that any modifications would require that same counsel's review. I told him that my mother was well looked after. I thanked him for calling. I hung up and added the date and a summary of the conversation to my notes file. Then I called Patricia, and I told her we needed to move to the next step. Over the following 6 weeks, with Patricia's help and with my mother's participation, I did tell her more. I told her enough to get her moving, which was harder than I expected, because she still loved him, and love makes the mind look for exits from the truth. We took several quiet, legal, documented steps. We had an in-person conversation with Patricia together, the 3 of us, where my mother heard directly from her attorney what the trust contained, what it protected, and what her rights were. I watched my mother's face during that meeting. It was the face of someone understanding something slowly and wishing they didn't. We updated the contact information and notification preferences on the trust so that any request to modify it would require written notice sent to both my mother and to me simultaneously. We documented Daniel's request and the drafted amendment and submitted a formal advisory letter to the trust file. And I took my mother to lunch, just the 2 of us, at a diner she and my father used to go to before I was born. I ordered coffee. She ordered the same thing she always ordered. And I told her everything. Not as an accusation. Not with anger. I laid it out the way I lay out documents at work, chronologically, clearly, without editorial. She sat with it for a long time. "He seemed so certain," she finally said, "about everything. He always seemed so certain." "I know," I said. "Your father was never certain about anything," she said. "He always checked twice. He asked me what I thought." She looked out the window. The parking lot was unremarkable. She looked at it like it contained something worth seeing. "I think I knew something was wrong," she said quietly. "I just didn't want to know it out loud." We sat there for another hour and a half. She talked about my father. She talked about the grief group, about how Daniel had seemed to understand her in a way that felt like being found. She talked about the peach tree. She talked about feeling embarrassed, which broke my heart more than anything else, because she had absolutely nothing to be embarrassed about. "You didn't do anything wrong," I told her. "You were grieving." He was looking for someone who was grieving. She nodded. She was not crying. She was doing the same thing she had done the morning my father died, holding herself very still and very steady on the outside, doing the hard work quietly. She filed for divorce 3 weeks later. Daniel did not take it quietly, which surprised no one. He retained an attorney of his own. There were some uncomfortable months. He made claims about contributions to the household, about his expectations entering the marriage. None of it touched the house, which was exactly what my father had built it to do. Patricia handled it with the kind of calm competence that made me wish I had gone to law school. The divorce was finalized 7 months after my mother walked into the diner and ordered what she always ordered. The day it was done, she called me and she said, "I'm going to plant something next to your father's peach tree." I asked her what. "I don't know yet," she said. "Something that takes a long time to grow." I have thought a lot, in the time since, about the folder, about the fact that my father sat down, years before he was sick, and thought carefully about what his absence might look like, about what my mother might be vulnerable to, about what I might need to know. He did not do it because he distrusted her. He did it because he loved her, and he knew that love, on its own, is not always enough to protect someone. He built something that held, not dramatically, not with a confrontation in a parking lot or a villain in handcuffs. It held because he was careful, and because he trusted me to be careful, and because we both did our jobs. There's a thing I have noticed in my years of working with documents and estates and the quiet machinery of people's lives. The people who end up most protected are almost never the ones who saw the danger coming. They're the ones whose loved ones saw it coming and said nothing flashy about it, who just built the wall before anyone needed it. My father built a good wall. My mother is planting something next to the peach tree. I don't know yet what it is. I'll find out when I visit next month. I have never told her everything that was in that letter. The parts about what to watch for. The parts that show how clearly he understood what grief can cost a person. Maybe I will someday. Or maybe some things are just between a father and his daughter, and that's enough. If you've ever watched someone you love lose their footing while they were still trying to find their way, you already know what it costs to stay quiet when you want to say everything, and to say only what they're ready to hear. That balance is the hardest thing. Harder than any document. Harder than any conversation with any attorney. My father knew that too. He wrote it in the letter, in his careful architectural print, in the last paragraph on the last page. He said, "Be patient. Be precise. And when the time comes, say what she's ready to hear. Not everything you know. She'll get there. You'll get there together." We did.